Borderlands, and more specifically Borderlands 2, is often seen as the All Father, the ultimate creation of what a looter shooter should be. It has influenced and created more or less a subgenre over the recent years, but did it really? Did Borderlands, Gearbox, and Randy Pitchford actually created this new subgenre? Are they the gods among loot shooters? Well, yes and no.
Yeah, I think I lost the beat.
The past 10 years had a huge influx on these so-called looter shooters or loot shooters, and though we label them as such, its official category tends to be a hybrid of RPG, specifically RPG elements, as the term RPG is so loosely used lately, and the other genre being the shooter genre, being a first-person or third-person perspective. The key part there being RPG, with specific elements of it cherry-picked to favor looting, dungeon crawling, and randomness in order to make the player feel fulfilled and rewarded through its randomized items, and essentially go on a treadmill in chase of better and better gear, levels, and ultimately progress their character to become ever more powerful, much like in any role-playing game. This small aspect of the RPG genre has been part of it since its existence. Almost every RPG, even from the tabletop days of Dungeons & Dragons, included some form of random looting, dungeon crawling, and the progression of your character through the same items. But it was in 1994 that the first real focus on the looting part of an RPG, once again, loose term, was made in the original Diablo. This is deserving of a video all on itself, but Diablo and its more perfected sequel, Diablo 2, set a precedent for a new subgenre, an action role-playing game focusing heavily on, well, action, as opposed to the traditional turn-based combat at the time, the procedural generated dungeon crawling, and of course, the glorious loot that tied in with your progression, more so than any other game before. On itself, its origins, the inspiration for Diablo, and in turn Borderlands 2, are not only traced back to role-playing games, but to roguelikes, games such as Rogue, NetHack, yet another subgenre of RPGs where the main focus lied in running through procedurally generated dungeons, levels, much like these so-called ARPGs of today, and progressing your character along the way, but having a lingering permadeath system. After the success of Diablo, many games like it came to fruition, the so-called Diablo clones that tried to replicate the formula. Some succeeded, some failed, yet no game dared to go outside of its comfort zone, of the action RPG, fantasy-esque, top-down asymmetric perspective type games. That is until 2007, with the releases of Hellgate London and Tabula Rasa, the former being the most interesting as it was developed by original Blizzard employees, some even involved in the original Diablo project. It was an action RPG much in the same as Diablo, however, with guns. The excitement and hype surrounding this game at the time was enormous. I too felt this feeling of wonder as the game presented this very dark and interesting world to explore, and the weaving of traditional RPG elements at the time, such as using abilities from a skill bar, leveling, looting, mixed in with regular shooting mechanics, simply looked awesome. Sadly, the game came with a lot of issues and failed to impress many of its audience. There's yet an older title, Phantasy Star Online, which is sometimes seen as the father of looter shooters. Its origins can be traced to the 80s. The specific title, however, was the first ever online game to be presented on consoles, a Dreamcast to be precise. It proved to be a highly successful game at the time, but on a personal level, setting it as the original looter shooter is a little bit of a stretch, since the shooting part of the game, though done in real time, isn't exactly what you would expect from a traditional shooting mechanics, even at its release. And not to say that these titles were the first ever FPS games or shooter games to blend RPG elements with the genre. BioShock and its spiritual predecessor System Shock, or better yet, the original Deus Ex all the way back in the 90s, had already accomplished that successfully. Hell, even Pathways into Darkness, a Bungie game and exclusive to Mac in 1993, had already mixed in some RPG elements with its shooting mechanics when it came to character-based skills, but the emphasis on looting, much like Diablo, was still yet to be achieved. It was then in 2009 that Gearbox, a company that so far was known for creating expansions for the highly successful and pivotal series in the FPS genre, Half-Life, and Brothers in Arms, yet another FPS franchise set during World War II, a successful series in its own right, albeit not as known at the time in comparison to other bigger titles like Battlefield or Call of Duty, but it proved that FPS games was something that Gearbox could do well. So what if we bring forth RPG elements, roguelike elements from the games we discussed, and blend it with FPS mechanics, and not repeating the same mistakes Hellgate London had went through? So could it work?
You should have seen the look on your face! One more step and it'll be your last!
Borderlands proved that an FPS RPG hybrid with an emphasis on loot-based progression could be done successfully. Loot was plentiful and fun, which is something that most games in the genre seem to not get lately. Be from looting caches for money, ammunition, or items themselves, it simply felt great. You were constantly improving your character through these same items, constantly feeding your brain with all those endorphins at seeing and getting more and more colorful, crazier, and powerful loot, showering you with it, literally. It had achieved what made an FPS game fun, and it had achieved what made Diablo fun in terms of its progression and loot-based system. But there's more to it that made Borderlands so appealing. Sure, it drew many inspirations from the old father Diablo, and it was the first game that really coined the term Diablo with guns. However, there was other aspects, big and small, that set Borderlands apart. For one, we had the so-called unique art style of cel shading. Though other games in the past had done similar graphic styles, such as 13, an awesome game by the way, Borderlands was the first game that grew big enough to make this style ever more popular in gaming. And even though it was bluntly copied from the short film Code Hunters, even the setting and a lot of other smaller bits in this short clip can be traced back to Borderlands, but in fairness, they eventually admitted they drew inspirations from it. But there is actually an interesting story behind all of this. As up to 2008, just 1 year before the game release, Borderlands had a much more realistic vibe to it. Characters design, the world, and general graphic style was much more akin to games like Mass Effect, Gears of War, the upcoming Rage game in 2010, or even Fallout. The team sought out a much more unique art style, drawing more inspiration from the Code Hunters film to present a more unique and fun style. But this new presentation blended perfectly with the overall look and feel the game had with this Mad Max style world, which itself was a big inspiration as well in the overall game, with the biggest hint probably being Moxxi's Underdome. And then there's the self-aware humor, creative and unique characters which are now loved, like Scooter, fun elemental guns, the enemies that have since become iconic in their craziness, like the Psycho. All of that made Borderlands feel unique, fresh, and well fun the minute you got out of the bus and initially met the charismatic and sometimes annoying Claptrap. And this didn't came out of nowhere. This was a company that, yes, was used to the more serious thematic setting of World War II with Brothers in Arms, but Randy Pitchford had worked in games such as Duke Nukem 3D, not to be confused with the atrocity they came up with in 2011, but the older version was much in the same as Borderlands, a very self-contained world with silly humor as you shoot everything in sight, except with more boobs.
You wanna dance? You wanna dance? You wanna dance? You wanna dance?
When I first got into Borderlands, I came from a little game called World of Warcraft, an MMORPG, and getting into this one just felt natural. And the reason for this is that Borderlands felt a lot like an MMO without the massively multiplayer part. And what do you know, Borderlands' inspiration was not only on Diablo, roguelikes, but Ultima Online, a very popular MMO in the late 90s, 2000s, and explains how MMO-esque the questing in the original Borderlands is. Even the talent system, the skill system, the way you progress your character outside of the items felt very old-school MMO in nature, with this pretty boring passive improvements with only a handful of fun ones being, of course, the active skills. And even weapon skills were akin to classic MMOs and RPGs to improve your accuracy and such the more you use it. Unlike the graphic style, a lot of these aspects were apparently reworked shortly before the release, as it didn't felt fantastical and RPG enough. The world itself was also quite open, separated by instances due to engine limitations, but also another aspect that made me feel like I was playing this pseudo MMO-like game. And I think that was an aspect that made me and a lot of people like the game at the time, is that it felt like an MMO world to get yourself lost into and make yourself a badass, especially with friends if you got to play in co-op. However, in retrospective, the questing was, bluntly putting it, boring to say the least. Fetch and kill quests for the most part. Though the fun shooting made up for it, it didn't change the fact how uninspiring they were, which is odd as a world, characters was ripe for more creative style of quests, and though they existed, they were too far in between. Taking aside the DLC, which on themselves were probably the best aspect of the original Borderlands, even in comparison to the later titles. But the reason for this is that the lore, the narrative surrounding the game was not well established, even during its early production. Every game needs to have a reason for you to do what you do, in this case, looting and shooting. And well, the Vault Hunter's theme of hunting for a mysterious treasure, a vault, eventually came to fruition, which was extremely fitting to the looter genre. But as you probably remember, narrative in the original Borderlands wasn't its strongest selling point. It was minimal at best, though fun in the way it was presented. I was particularly surprised at the Cthulhu last boss and thinking, whoa, this lore can actually go to some crazy places, but it's possible that the lore setup came too late into production to make it more relevant, or simply wasn't the main driving force in the original, as they wished to focus more on the looting and shooting part, which is completely understandable taking in mind how risky this project originally was. All that said, pondering more about it, a lot of the aspects of the original Borderlands felt really repetitive. The questing, the zones that you went through, all felt very similar, taking aside once again the amazing DLC packs. Enemy variety was quite poor. Bandits and skags makes up more than 50% of the game, probably exaggerating a little bit, but you know what I mean. Guns and loot, though amazing and varied at every turn, all looked very similar aesthetically as you leveled. I was quite surprised at myself replaying the game at how repetitive it could be, more so than the genre already is at the fundamental level. At the endgame, something that you could aim for and just grind out for more and more loot also felt a little lacking, and systems that make looter games fun to repeat, like procedural generated levels, though advertised at first, did not make it to the final product. But all these faults were natural to be found. In essence, was the first of its kind, not only the first successful looter shooter, but also the first looter shooter for Gearbox, and it's quite impressive that after so many hurdles and shortcomings, a successful product was made. So, was it possible for a sequel to iterate and improve on all of this?
I can't just have some psychopathic murderers getting to the vault before I do. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's cute that y'all think you're the heroes of this little adventure, but you're not. Welcome to Pandora, kiddos.
So So now we know what makes a looter shooter fun. We know what ticks the right boxes on players, so let's just go crazier and bigger. That's the way I see Borderlands 2. The original showed how it was possible to create a fun looter game in the shooter genre. Finally, the developers were took by surprise at how successful Borderlands was, so making a sequel was undoubtedly on the table. The original had its faults, so Borderlands 2 took what made the original great and improved upon it, which is just how every sequel should be. Criticized the original for having a very lacking story? Well, now you have one. Tons of dialogue to boot, quests and even side quests that actually had a story behind them that fitted this crazy fun world. I still haven't forgotten the one where you go out of your way to implement this robot AI in some bodysuit, only to have it turn on you over and over again until you decide to either turn it into a shield or weapon for you to use as a reward, which in turn makes those item slots talk to you as you play, pulling cheesy jokes or Terminator references. Quests had the potential to be memorable. How about that? Characters were better than ever. Scooter, Ellie, Tiny Tina, among others, grew on us to remember their crazy personalities and looks. And then we had the villain, Handsome Jack, which, let's be honest, always reminded me of a sci-fi Joker, but actually his inspiration is weirdly based on Nathan Fillion during an interview of all places. And Jack, as a villain, added so much more to the game. It added meaning and reason for your actions. It added a threat to the world, both visual with the Hyperion ship constantly looming over you and in the narrative.
This is what I don't get about you bad guys. You know the hero's gonna win, but you just don't die quickly. Man, example, this one guy in New Haven, right? City's burning, people are dying left and right, yada yada yada. This jackal rushes me with a spoon, a freaking spoon, and I'm dying laughing, right? So I scoop out his stupid little eyeballs with it, and his kids are all, wah! And I can't even, he can't see where he's going, he's bumping into stuff, and anyway, I don't know, maybe you had to be there. The moral is, you're a total bitch.
Loot, the foundation of the game, got even better. 1 billion guns was the slogan. I'm not sure if that was the case. Most likely not, but it felt like it. You never came across the same gun twice. They were crazier than ever and now actually look aesthetically different. You were showered in loot now more than ever before, and it didn't take 20 levels or 40 levels to get some crazy fun loot. It started right from the start. It's a loot game, so give us the goddamn loot. And that's what Borderlands 2 did with no questions asked. And like the original, the shops always did a great job to counteract bad RNG in the game, which is one of the issues with this type of loot games. A very small thing, but with a big positive when it works in your favor. Something that many loot shooters still do not include. Zones also followed the same design. They were now more varied, with different themes. Enemies, such as bandits, actually had clans, groups, and weren't just the same crazy bandits and psychos over and over again. They actually had minimal mechanics for you to deal with, like Goliaths that go crazy after getting headshots. Every new system or mechanic implemented, it just made the world crazier, but also made the gameplay even more awesome, fun, and satisfying. The RPG elements, in terms of progressing your character together with your gear, got more complex and in-depth, with the addition of elements like slag. So now there was actually builds you could create. Interesting builds at that, especially on the Siren character, to make all the gameplay even more fun, giving you goals in the process as you progress your character, making you push forward with the game, and giving more incentive to run extra playthroughs and get more levels and play the so-called endgame. The hub was cool and memorable, with a nice little game to teach kids about gambling. No joke, I spent a good amount of my playtime in Mox's bar playing the slot machines for just random ass loot. Why? I don't know, but like the shops was yet another way for you to get loot in case you were unlucky out in the world. There is almost no aspect in Borderlands 2 that wasn't made better from the original. More cosmetics is another, and to this day, it still retains the title of the best looter shooter game to many of us. Some might argue the title for Warframe, but that's maybe a topic for a different video. But after greatness, after being one of the most successful 2K games in history,
They're all gonna pay.
Things are gonna get a lot better around here once I'm in charge.
Yeah! Things are about to get awesome! High five! Or, not.
Borderlands, the pre-sequel, got a lot of slack since its release, and partially the reason for this was that it wasn't developed by Gearbox, but 2K Australia, as Gearbox only provided support, and the game did a lot of missteps. Being set in the moon was cool, and the zero-gravity gameplay was also an interesting twist, but there's a lot of weird decisions in the game, such as the loss of slag weapons, weaker endgame, bugs, and other issues such as pacing just made the game suffer as a whole, and in general people were just so hyped after Borderlands 2. It set the standards so high that after it people were craving something even bigger, or at least more of the same, and the prequel felt like a regression, not just in the story being a pre-sequel, which itself was pretty interesting as it delved in Jack's past, but it simply did not live up to the expectations, and in a lot of ways felt like a fancy DLC pack or expansion. In the end, I think it's commendable that Gearbox didn't rush Borderlands 3 straight afterwards, stating how their goal was to make it bigger and better, to surpass Borderlands 2 in every possible way, and to do that would take time. And yes, there are times since then their other game releases have been nothing but subpar and, let's be honest, ridden with lies, especially Randy himself. However, we'll have to wait and see if that comes with any decent result. Regardless, Borderlands 2 shows an amazing example of how a looter shooter should be done. Keywords being loot and variety. You need to be constantly showered with loot. If not, what's the point of making one anyway? The other is variety. You need variety not only in the loot, but in the enemies, in the quests, or levels that you go through. Cosmetics also play a big part and need to be varied as well. Everything must follow what the loot is doing in being random, fun, varied, and then setting a nice pace as you progress through it all, to constantly make you feel you're getting more powerful over time, and needless to say, good shooting mechanics and just fun gunplay. And everything about Borderlands follows the same philosophies. You may add or change some of these aspects, like Warframe has done, such as an extra focus on cosmetics, crafting, or adding more MMORPG-like features, such as raiding, dungeons, PvP, but the loot, the progression attached to it, itself being the foundation, needs to be cemented at the core of the game and connected perfectly with the other systems. If not, is doomed to fail, and that can be often tricky to do. Another aspect that Borderlands succeeded on is that it isn't focused on the endgame. A lot of the current looter shooters focus so much on the endgame portion of it, almost like an MMO, and maybe that's just the direction the community, the players have forced developers to design their game, but in Borderlands, no matter if you level 1 or 50, getting loot was always fun and satisfying, with every rarity available to you. The endgame focus should be present, but the early game experience should not be made lesser in terms of loot. This isn't a traditional RPG nor an MMO with a more linear progression in terms of items. It has its own set of rules to make it fun and exciting, meaning giving you cool stuff right from the start. Its huge downside though, it's open to the most exploitative practices in the current gaming industry, from loot boxes to games as a service, and I believe is yet another reason why so many loot shooters fail, is that they cave in to greed, as is a genre that sets itself so perfectly for those practices, ultimately making the game fail. And I hope that Borderlands 3 does live up to the expectations and do the same Borderlands 2 did to the original Borderlands, taking what made it great and make it even better. If only there was no Epic Game Store.